All right, tonight we slip off your shoes, roll back the layers of modern agriculture, and shuffle barefoot into a forgotten corner of the past. The year is somewhere between 1250 and 1480. You're trudging along a muddy lane behind a crooked wooden cart, headed for a village market that smells like wet wool sour beer and turnip tops. Your cloak's hem is damp. Your hands are numb. And the only thing you've eaten since dawn is a lump of cheese, the consistency of limestone. But tucked into a canvas satchel at your side is something precious. A cluster of pale, finger-like roots, knobby and ghost white, dusted with soil and mystery. Skirret. You haven't heard that name since, well, probably never. And you're not alone. Most people today wouldn't recognize this sweet root if it tap-danced across their compost pile. But in the medieval world, skirret was sugar before sugar. Now, before we dig in, subscribe before you fall asleep, or I'll sneak medieval kale into your cereal. And let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. We're building a globe full of sleepless vegetable nerds, one insomniac at a time. Now go ahead and kill the overhead light. Maybe throw a blanket over your shoulders or crack the window just a bit to let in that perfectly spooky breeze. It's story time, and tonight you're planting skirret in a frost-covered monastery garden. You kneel beside a stone wall, still damp from morning fog. The monk beside you gestures with a dirt-stained trowel. Sium cicerum, he mumbles, eyes twinkling. Latin for skirret, or sugar root, if you ask the English. Skirret grows like a polite little octopus. Thin white roots radiating from a central stalk, each one naturally sweet, especially after the first frost. That's the trick. They need cold to concentrate their sugar. You chew one raw. It's got the crunch of a carrot, but sweeter, like a parsnip that went to finishing school. The monks loved it, not just for flavor, but because skirret thrived in bad soil, required little care, and could overwinter like a champ. It was one of the few vegetables you could pull straight from the earth in January and still chew without breaking a tooth. Historians still argue whether skirret originated in China or Central Asia before winding its way westward through Roman traders and monastic gardens. Some claim it was cultivated by Charlemagne's imperial farms. Others point to 9th century herbals, describing its use in bitter stews. Either way, by the 14th century, it had dug deep into European diets, particularly among the clergy who had time to fuss with unusual crops. But outside the cloister, skirret wasn't exactly a crowd favorite. It was fiddly to clean full of hair-fine roots that had to be wound or scraped. Peasants, already elbow-deep in cabbages and onions, didn't have time for a root that needed grooming. Still, it had its defenders. In the right hand's skirret was transformed, boiled it, softened into a mild, sugary mash, roasted it, caramelized, like a whisper of molasses. And in royal kitchens, where idle hands made complicated things, it sometimes got whipped into delicate fritters, lightly battered and fried in lard. Think medieval churros. Sort of. You remember one evening in a manor kitchen, the air thick with nutmeg and smoke, as a cook plucked skirret roots from a cauldron, sliced them lengthwise, and dipped them in batter. You ate 3 while the Baron wasn't looking, and then you ate a 4th. Skirret wasn't just food. It was also mild medicine. Physicians of the age, ever fond of guessing, prescribed it for clearing phlegm and warming the belly. Whether it worked or not, who knows? But compared to the leeches and ox bile, it was practically modern wellness cuisine. Here's a fringe detail to chew on. Some 15th century herbals warn that too much skirret could overexcite the humors. Translation. It might make you too cheerful. One translation even hints at aphrodisiac qualities. That's right. Skirret, the medieval vegetable of love. You picture a court jester waving a skirret root at a tavern girl, shouting, "One bite, and you'll fancy my cod piece." You can almost hear the lute music. But skirret didn't last. The Renaissance rolled in with its pomaded hair and imported spices. Sugarcane arrived. Potatoes stormed the continent. And skirret faded like an old candle. By the 1700s, it was mostly a footnote in dusty gardening books. Today, you'd have to tag a heritage seed bank to send you a handful, or befriend a medieval reenactor with too many raised beds. But imagine bringing it back. A frost-sweet root growing in poor soil, demanding little water, and giving you a taste of something ancient and oddly elegant. It's the anti-fast food. And in a world rediscovering food, resilience skirret's comeback is overdue. So you take another bite of the pale root. Earthy, sweet, a little fibrous, and suddenly you're not just a tired farmer. You're a time traveler, chewing your way back through centuries, one forgotten vegetable at a time. You wake the next morning with a sore back and a smear of chimney soot on your cheek, remnants of last night's fire, and the stone floor you slept on. Outside, mist snakes between the cottages. You throw on your tunic, yank, open the wooden door, and step into the cool hush of dawn. There's work to do. At the edge of the common, behind a crumbling hedge, and beside an overworked compost pile, grows a scrappy, stubborn patch of green. It's not glamorous. The leaves are dusty, coarse, and shaped like blunt arrows. But this is Good King Henry, the peasant's spinach. Don't let the name fool you. There's no royal connection here. This plant isn't named after a king. It's named mockingly or affectionately after a fictional one. Because for hundreds of years, Chenopodium bonus henricus was the leafy lifeline of villagers too poor for proper produce. You reach down and pluck a few leaves. They're soft underneath, a little rough on top, and carry the earthy scent of wet clay and stubborn survival. You chew one raw. It's mild, with a faint tang, like spinach that forgot how to be fancy. This wasn't a cultivated crop in most places. It simply showed up, growing in barnyards, waste patches, along the chicken coop wall, or wherever people weren't paying attention. That's why some called it fat hen or poor man's asparagus. Medieval families used it like wild spinach, boiled down in pottages, thrown into stews, or wrapped in pastry for an early version of a hand pie. Historians still argue whether Good King Henry was ever deliberately cultivated or merely tolerated. In some 13th century monastic records, it appears alongside kitchen herbs planted on purpose. In others, it's listed with weeds, as if even the scribes couldn't decide whether it was a vegetable or a nuisance. But in hungry times, it was gold. You remember one particular winter, the year the river flooded and the grain stores turned sour with mold. Everyone was thin. Even the pigs looked worried. And then someone remembered the patch of Good King Henry behind the thatcher's hut. The village women scraped off the frost, gathered armfuls, and by nightfall, soup bubbled in every hearth. Better than eating your boots, old Matilda said, dropping a stone into the pot for luck. Nutritionally, it packed more iron and vitamin C than most people realized. Medicinal texts claimed it helped with indigestion and cleansed the blood. Some healers even ground its roots into poultices to treat skin boils, though the smell was memorable. Here's your quirky tidbit. In some remote corners of Europe, the stalks of Good King Henry were blanched like asparagus and served to noble guests who never realized they were eating a weed from the cow pen. The cook would say it was an alpine delicacy, and everyone would nod politely while chewing a mouthful of medieval lawn. And despite its lowly status, the plant had resilience. Left alone, it could live for years, returning each spring with new leaves, sending its roots deeper into the soil, surviving hoof prints, floods, and frost. It didn't need pampering. It just needed a corner. There's a sort of magic in that. Imagine your modern vegetable aisle, a regimented row of plastic-wrapped greens under humming fluorescence. Then picture Good King Henry growing wild and ragged beside a wooden fence watered by rain and warmed by whatever sun breaks through the clouds. You don't measure it in yield per acre. You measure it in memories. The first bite of stew after a long sickness. The smell of boiling leaves mixing with peat smoke. The way the village children learned to pluck it from the soil without being told. Good King Henry asks nothing but a little space. No pesticides, no fancy irrigation. Just dirt time and someone to notice. In fact, its quiet usefulness is probably why it vanished. As agriculture industrialized crops that didn't conform, didn't grow uniformly, didn't store well, didn't market easily, got nudged off the stage. Good King Henry was too humble, too scrappy. It didn't dress up well for the produce section, but it's still out there, hiding in corners. A few foragers know where to look. Some organic gardeners have revived it, sowing seeds from old stock and sharing harvests at farmers' markets under names like heritage greens or perennial spinach. You brush your fingers over the leaves once more. They're damp with morning dew, trembling in the breeze. Not glamorous, but honest. And as the sun lifts over the thatched roofs, you imagine a world where this forgotten green makes a quiet return. Not as a trend or a superfood, but as a quiet act of botanical rebellion. Because sometimes the best things are the ones that wait patiently to be remembered. By midday, the sun has broken through the low mist, warming your shoulders as you trudge a rutted path lined with wild flowers and wheel tracks. A windmill creaks in the distance. Chickens argue somewhere behind a stone wall. You're making your way to the edge of the manor fields where the real curiosities grow. The Lord's cook sent you here for something rooty but strange. And sure enough, poking from the earth like fuzzy paintbrushes dipped in dust, you spot them salsify. Yes, salsify, also known as the oyster plant, which is weird because it has absolutely no relation to oysters, and most medieval people had probably never even seen one. Yet if you roast this root and close your eyes, you'll swear it tastes like shellfish, or at least what shellfish might taste like if it had been dug from a monastery garden. You yank one free. It's long, thin, and covered in pale fuzz, like a dandelion root that went on a juice cleanse. Raw, it's bitter, but cooked creamy, nutty, slightly briny, like someone buried a soup in the soil and forgot about it. Salsify was a darling of medieval kitchen gardens, especially in France and Italy. The plant likely arrived via trade routes from the eastern Mediterranean. and quickly found a niche in the gardens of nobles, monks, and anyone who enjoyed saying odd words at dinner. It wasn't flashy, but it was flexible, stewed, fried, mashed, even baked into pies. And unlike many other root vegetables, salsify thrived in colder months. That meant it became a winter staple, especially in places where options dwindled by February to turnips or regrets. Historians still argue whether salsify's popularity peaked in the medieval period or whether its real glory came during the Renaissance, when exotic became fashionable and French chefs were elbow-deep in culinary experimentation. Some say it was considered a cure for melancholy. Others suggest it was used in love potions. You know, in case your knight's heart needed some extra seasoning. Here's your fringe fun fact. One surviving 14th century manuscript refers to salsify as goat's beard, which sounds either charming or mildly insulting, depending on your audience. The name came from the way its flowering head puffs out into a big, fluffy orb, almost like a wish dandelion on steroids. You can blow on it and make a wish, but it probably won't help with your taxes. You carry a bunch of roots back to the manor kitchens, where the cook, an imposing woman named Elise, greets you with a grunt. She grabs the salsify, scrapes it with a blade the size of a canoe paddle, and tosses the clean roots into a bubbling pot. A minute later, the whole kitchen smells like butter and sea foam. "Help me plate," she says, handing you a wooden bowl and a carving fork. "And mind the salsify. It gets sad if you overcook it." You chuckle, but she's right. Salsify, when mistreated, turns to mush, still edible, but lacking character. When cooked just right, though it's silk on the tongue. Smooth, complex, faintly mysterious. You serve it with barley onions and wild mushrooms. The Lord proclaims it a dish worthy of feast day. He doesn't know it came from the scrappy patch behind the piggery. Here's the strange thing. Even though salsify once fed thousands across Europe, it nearly disappeared by the late 19th century. Why? Two reasons. First, it's a slow grower, often taking up to 150 days to mature. Second, it's tricky to harvest. The roots snap easily. Too much rain and they rot. Too little and they shrivel. And yet, despite all this fuss, you get it. There's something about eating a vegetable that makes no sense. One that tastes like seafood, looks like broom hair, and somehow survived centuries because someone somewhere decided it was worth keeping around. There's even a darker, curious footnote. Some folklore links salsify to secrecy. Witches, it's said, planted it outside their huts to mask the scent of their brews, or to confuse the senses of nosy villagers. Whether true or not, the plant does have a knack for hiding. Its roots burrow deep. Its tops blend into weeds. Unless you're looking for it, you'll miss it entirely, which is, of course, part of its charm. So you sit by the hearth later that evening, chewing on a roasted chunk of salsify, the firelight playing across your spoon. You wonder who the first person was to dig it up and decide to eat it. Probably someone very brave, or very hungry. And you wonder too what else we've lost, buried under centuries of convenience and sameness. Salsify is a gentle reminder. Not everything strange is useless. Some things just take time. You're on the coast now. The wind is stronger here, briny and sharp, like a slap from Neptune himself. Waves chew the edge of the cliffs, while gulls scream above you in that timeless seagull way, loud, relentless, probably judging your fashion choices. You're following a crooked footpath along the chalky cliffside, and your basket's almost empty. The Abbey cook asked you to gather something fresh, something rare, and you know just the spot. You round a mossy boulder and crouch low, squinting between tufts of grass and tangled seaweed. There, it is sea kale. It doesn't look like much. Pale green leaves, thick and fleshy, curling like waves frozen mid-crash. But you recognize it instantly. This is the vegetable that feeds where others fail. The one that shrugs off salt wind and drought like a knight in a bad mood. Sea kale, or Crambe maritima, is a coastal champion. Medieval farmers didn't grow it in rows, they found it. Tucked along the pebbly margins of storm-battered beaches where little else would thrive. Some villagers learned to transplant it, building stone rings in their gardens to mimic its salty home and trick it into staying. You snap off a few young shoots. They're pale, almost ghostly white. This is key. Before the plant greens up, these tender stems can be steamed and served like asparagus. They taste nutty, buttery, and faintly oceanic. A seaside springtime treat. Historians still argue whether sea kale was truly cultivated in the Middle Ages or simply foraged regularly enough to become familiar. In some records, it's classified as a wilding. In others, it's described as a shore cabbage, favored by monks and coastal communities during lean seasons. Either way, it was known it was used, and it was appreciated at least until someone invented bread pudding. Here's a quirky detail. Some medieval texts list sea kale as both food and building material. Its dried stalks were woven into fencing roof patchwork and even makeshift fishing nets. The entire plant was a multitasker, sustainable before sustainability became a buzzword. you head back uphill with your bounty. The path is slick with sea mist, and the hem of your cloak is damp again, because of course it is. The abbey's garden walls appear like a mirage above the cliffs. You imagine the cooks there waiting eagerly for your harvest, though eager in monastic terms usually means someone grunts once and gives you half a nod. Inside the kitchen, a novice takes the sea kale with a reverent expression. "We'll boil it with barley," he says, "and a bit of smoked eel." You try not to make a face. Eel is a lot, but it pairs well with the kale's mellow saltiness. Trust the monks. They've been flavor matching since before seasoning was cool. What made sea kale special, though, wasn't just its taste. It was the message food can grow where it shouldn't. It defied rules. No rich soil, no clean water, just wind rock and sea spray, and still it thrived. You begin to admire it, not just as a vegetable, but as an attitude. It's also absurdly nutritious. Packed with vitamin C iron and trace minerals, sea kale may have helped prevent scurvy before scurvy had a name. Sailors who foraged it along the shorelines often recovered faster than those who didn't. Coincidence? Maybe. Or maybe leafy miracles don't need marketing. Its decline came predictably with progress. As agriculture moved inland and food became more commodified, coastal crops like sea kale were forgotten. Too tricky to cultivate, too variable to ship, too weird to brand. And yet, it's making a quiet return. A few niche chefs and coastal farmers in the UK are now reintroducing sea kale into fine dining menus. Not bad for a vegetable that was once collected barefoot in the rain while being screamed at by gulls. You finish your day watching the tide roll in. The rocks are slick with moss. The air tastes like metal and salt. You nibble one last blanched stalk of sea kale. It doesn't change your life, but it does make you feel like you're part of something bigger. Like you've eaten a piece of the coastline itself, survived another long, strange day, and understood just for a moment why monks would risk slippery cliffs and sodden boots to gather this particular green. Because when something grows in defiance of its conditions, it's worth remembering. You're elbow deep in loam now, somewhere in the manor's back garden, where the fancy plants grow the ones too fussy or foreign to thrive in the wild. This corner's neatly fenced, suspiciously weedless, and smells faintly of old compost and powdered bone meal. And right here, in an orderly row of squat, spindly plants, is something most villagers wouldn't even recognize scorzonera. It's a name that sounds like it belongs on a spellbook shelf, or a suspicious elixir sold from a cart with too many bells. But scorzonera is simply black salsify, dark-skinned cousin to the oyster-tasting root you met earlier. Only this one's moodier, richer, and just a little bitter. Like the older sibling who went off to study alchemy in Prague and came back wearing silk gloves and a story they wouldn't explain. You pull one from the soil. It's long, slender, and coated in charcoal black skin, like a licorice stick that's seen some things. Underneath, creamy white flesh that cooks up smooth and mellow. The trick is scraping off the outer skin, easier said than done, with medieval tools. You've snapped more than one scorzonera in half during harvest. The kitchen staff forgives you. Eventually. Scorzonera likely rode into Western Europe after the Crusades, bundled with seeds and spices and unfamiliar smells. Historians still argue whether it was first cultivated in Spain or Italy, or even farther east in the Ottoman territories, where root vegetables reigned supreme. Its name may come from the old Italian scorza nera, black bark, which frankly sounds like something a wizard yells before summoning a thunderstorm. The roots were prized for more than just flavor. In medical texts of the 15th century, scorzonera was hailed as a cure for melancholia of the spleen and an antidote to venomous creatures. That's right. Eat enough of this, and you might just survive a badger bite. Or at least, that's what Brother Theobald swore by after a hedgehog-related incident he refused to explain. Here's your quirky tidbit. Scorzonera was once considered a nobleman's root. In France, it was served alongside roasted game, and in some courts, it appeared in elaborate feasts as a sort of edible sculpture base, because apparently mashed root art was a thing. Imagine it, a pheasant centerpiece perched atop a mountain of scorzonera puree, flanked by tiny flags and a sprig of rosemary. But it wasn't just for show. When properly cooked, simmered gently, or baked with wild herbs, it had a rich, slightly nutty flavor. It held its shape, unlike its floppy cousin, salsify. That made it perfect for stews meant to impress, or dishes that had to travel across a courtyard before reaching someone in a velvet robe. Still, it was labor-intensive, and the black skin stained fingers, and it didn't store quite as well as turnips or parsnips. So when New World crops arrived, things like potatoes and sweet corn that grew faster and looked less like spells gone wrong, scorzonera slipped from the menus of manor halls and into the obscurity of seed catalogs. But you still remember it. That one stormy evening when the cook was desperate and the pantry bare, and someone found 3 withered scorzonera roots clinging to life near the compost bin. You boiled them with barley, wild leeks, and a bit of stale cheese. And everyone called it surprisingly decent, which, from a medieval noble, is basically a standing ovation. Today you peel another root with a dull knife and wonder, what if we brought scorzonera back? Not just for nostalgia, but for resilience. It's tough, tolerant of drought, and immune to most pests. You don't need pesticides or perfect soil. You just need time and a little willingness to scrub black mud from your fingernails. Imagine walking into a modern restaurant and seeing black root gratin on the menu. You lean in, order it take a bite, and suddenly you're sitting beside a smoky hearth while someone in a woolen cloak hands you a bowl and says, "Careful, it's hot." Because that's the magic of scorzonera. It's not glamorous, it's not trendy, but it carries centuries of flavor tradition and the strange hope that somewhere out there, a root that tastes like buttered walnuts and folklore still has a place in your kitchen. You wrap the harvested roots in a cloth pat down the dirt on your knees and rise slowly as the sun dips behind the trees. In the distance, the bell tolls for vespers, and in your basket, the black roots glisten like buried treasure, finally remembered. Evening is creeping in now, quiet and golden, and the manor gardens are giving up their warmth to the cooling breeze. You walk softly between rows of herbs and fading flowers, brushing past stalks that rattle like dry paper. At your feet, half hidden under tangled clover and crumbling leaves, is a delicate cluster of green rosettes, tiny, tender, almost bashful. You crouch down and pick a handful. It's lamb's lettuce. Don't let the name mislead you. There are no lambs involved, no shepherds lurking with salad cravings. This plant, Valerianella locusta, also goes by corn salad, field salad, or if you're feeling particularly medieval, mush. It's soft, subtle, easy to miss, but in the dead of winter, it was a miracle. You bring a leaf to your mouth. The taste is gentle, like butter lettuce that whispered its flavor instead of shouting. Slightly nutty, barely sweet, no bitterness. It's the kind of green that makes you feel like spring is thinking about calling you back. Medieval farmers didn't cultivate lamb's lettuce the way they did cabbage or onions. It grew in the margins between rows of wheat under fruit trees along fence lines. It was a gift, not a chore. It didn't demand to be planted. It offered itself quietly to those who noticed. Historians still argue whether lamb's lettuce was part of formal garden planning or a happy accident. Some monastic records suggest it was encouraged rather than sown, allowed to flourish in shady corners where little else grew. Others say it was wild food for wild people, gleaned in haste, devoured in gratitude. You remember one frost-bitten morning in January when the ground was frozen solid and every other plant drooped like a sad lute string. But there, huddled near the stone wall, was lamb's lettuce, green, alive, almost smug about it. The kitchen maid called it hope leaves. She'd toss them with vinegar and dried berries just to remind everyone that winter wouldn't last forever. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some medieval households believed that lamb's lettuce could protect against forgetfulness. Not magic exactly, but close. If you ate enough, you'd remember your prayers, your manners, and your dead uncle's name at feast day. Whether or not it worked, at least you had something fresh to chew while reciting psalms. It's not a flashy plant, no flowers, no drama, but its value was in its timing. When everything else had given up, lamb's lettuce stayed green. It didn't just survive cold, it thrived in it. While kale hunkered down and spinach sulked, this humble salad leaf spread quietly across the soil, as if to say, "Don't worry, you'll eat tonight." And in a world without greenhouses or global shipping, that was enough to make it beloved. The taste brings back memories. That winter, when the snow reached the windowsills and you all wore 2 tunics indoors, the cook's knuckles red from scrubbing root vegetables, the silence of snow pressing against thatch, and then, surprise, a bowl of lamb's lettuce. Nothing grand, just fresh and alive. It faded, of course, as agriculture grew more structured. Lamb's lettuce was too informal, too inconsistent. You couldn't standardize it. It refused to be tidy. So it was replaced by lettuces with stronger shelf lives and better photogenic traits. But not completely. In some parts of France, it held on passed from one garden to the next, hidden in seed bundles, tucked into salads with walnut oil and goat cheese. And in the past few decades, it's even crept back into modern grocery stores, usually in plastic tubs labeled gourmet greens, as if the plant itself had changed outfits. But you know better. You know it's still the same little fighter, still the same green whisper from a frozen garden, saying, "Hey, spring's coming." So you kneel beside the wall, pick a final handful, and tuck it into your pouch. Your fingers are cold, but your stomach already anticipates the first bite. You imagine pairing it with grated apple, a drizzle of cider vinegar, maybe a sliver of old cheese, a medieval salad worth writing a song about. You rise slowly, the sky fading to a purplish slate. Behind you, the chapel bells echo again, softer this time, like lullabies to the vegetables sleeping in the soil. And in your heart, you file lamb's lettuce away, not just as food, but as a promise. Because sometimes the smallest, quietest things show up exactly when you need them most. The sun is down now, and the garden glows only in flickers, torchlight dancing across wet leaves, shadows stretching long and crooked between trellises. You pass a stone arch and into a more overgrown part of the estate, somewhere half abandoned, where the weeds get bold and the air smells faintly of mint and moss. Here, something odd catches your eye. Tall stalks with glossy green leaves and yellowish flower umbels that remind you of celery. If celery spent a summer studying abroad in Italy, you've just rediscovered Alexander's. Yes, Alexander's, a plant so ancient that the Romans were already bored of it by the time it got to medieval Britain. Known scientifically as Smyrnium olusatrum, it was once called the parsley of Alexandria, though in truth, it tastes like someone took celery, added a splash of citrus, a twist of black pepper, and then dared you to like it. You break off a stem and nibble the end. The texture is crisp, the flavor complex, not quite sweet, not quite bitter, a bit floral, a bit earthy. It's the kind of vegetable that doesn't want to be understood too quickly. In medieval kitchens, Alexander's was a staple, especially before more familiar greens like spinach and celery, muscled in with their easy flavors and obedient shapes. It was used root to seed stems, boiled like asparagus. Leaves tossed into potages, seeds crushed for spice, and roots roasted until they lost their toughness and gained a subtle sweetness. Historians still argue whether Alexander's was ever fully domesticated or merely tolerated. It seeded itself aggressively and liked to roam, showing up along roadside verges, crumbling castle walls, and anywhere monks dumped compost. For many, it was the bridge between herbs and vegetables, a plant that didn't fit neatly into any culinary category, and maybe didn't care to. Here's your quirky tidbit. In old herbal texts, Alexander's was prescribed for cold stomachs and thick phlegms. One remedy insisted it opens the obstructions of the liver and provokes urination very profitably. Medieval code for it makes you pee like a racehorse, but your liver will thank you. You remember a feast day, stew where Alexander's was the star. The cook boiled the stalks in mead, then pan-fried them with onions and powdered mustard seed. The result was deeply aromatic, almost floral, slightly spicy. The noble guests had no idea what they were eating, but everyone cleaned their bowl. One of them asked if it was some rare spice from Venice. The cook just smirked and went back to her cauldron. And yet, despite its utility and taste, Alexander's vanished. Why likely? because it was too wild. It didn't grow in straight rows. Its flavor was unpredictable. Some years it was sweet, others bitter. It laughed in the face of standardization. As more orderly crops took over spinach, celery, parsley, Alexander's was slowly pushed to the margins, literally and metaphorically. By the 18th century, it was considered a relic, a curiosity, something that only showed up in apothecaries' notes or on the edges of ancient ruins. But it never fully disappeared. Even now, in coastal England and parts of northern France, Alexander's still seeds itself freely. Foragers gather it in spring, careful not to take too much. Some chefs, always eager for forgotten flavors, have begun reintroducing it to menus, pairing it with oily fish, lamb, or lemony broths. And here's the fun part. If you don't harvest it, Alexander's becomes outrageously tall, almost chest height, with clusters of yellow-green flowers, buzzing with bees. It looks like it's auditioning for a spot in a fantasy novel. And it kind of is. You reach down and gently pull up a root thick and fibrous, smelling of pepper and wet earth. It won't win any beauty contests. But when you hold it in your hands, you're holding centuries, kitchen scraps from Roman forts, garden, secrets from Benedictine abbeys, the echoes of stew pots hung over hearths no longer burning. Back in the kitchen, you clean the stalks and slice them into coins. The novice beside you grimaces. "It smells weird," he says, like the forest got into the salad. You just smile. "Good," you say. That means it's working, because Alexander's isn't here to please you. It's here to remind you that flavor used to be a little wild, a little stubborn, and a little strange. You stir the pot, the scent rising warm and sharp in the air. And for a moment, under the crackling torchlight, you feel like you've uncovered a secret ingredient. One the modern world forgot, not because it wasn't good, but because it didn't fit the mold. And those, as it turns out, are the plants worth remembering. You're on the road again, leaving behind the garden plots and manor walls, headed toward the deep fields where the real wild things grow. The sun is gone, replaced by a sky smeared with cold stars, and your path is lit by a swinging lantern hooked to your belt. Crickets chirp. A fox cries in the distance, somewhere between a laugh and a shriek. You follow a worn footpath toward a grove where you've heard something curious grows. Not quite a vegetable, not quite a root, but something with stories in its bones. There, nestled beneath a tangle of hawthorn and brambles, you find them spindly green stalks with delicate blue flowers, and beneath the soil, something special, rampion. Yes, rampion, the salad leaf of saints, the root of old soldiers and old stories. Most modern folks only know it from a single misunderstood fairy tale, Rapunzel. But this isn't fiction. This was food. Rampion, or Campanula rapunculus, was once a common sight in medieval gardens and meadows. It gave you both greens and roots, 2 harvests in one. The leaves were soft, tender, slightly spicy, a bit like arugula, with a charm offensive. The roots, pale crunchy, with a radish meets parsnip flavor that earned them a loyal following from hungry monks and footsore travelers alike. You pull one from the earth. It comes up easily, the soil loamy and loose. The root is long and pale, the top crowned with leaves still glistening from night dew. You bite a piece, fresh, peppery, and sharp enough to wake the brain. A good companion for bread and cheese, or for marching through a snowstorm. Historians still argue whether rampion was ever cultivated widely or just gathered with such consistency that it became embedded in rural diets. Some abbey records list it in formal herb gardens, others in foraging guides meant for pilgrims. Either way, it was considered a vegetable of the people. Simple, functional, tasty. Here's your quirky tidbit. In some regions, rampion was believed to cleanse the blood and improve one's singing voice. Choir boys were fed rampion before big masses. Not because it worked, though, maybe it did, but because tradition whispered that it made the soul lighter. Who needs science? When folklore hands you a lullaby, you recall one winter's eve when the parish priest fell ill, and the village healer made a tonic from rampion root honey and warmed wine. The results were inconclusive, but the priest smiled for the first time in days, so they called it a miracle. Or maybe a coincidence, or maybe just decent soup. But we can't talk rampion without mentioning its fairy tale twin. In Grimm's telling, a pregnant woman craves the rampion leaves growing in a witch's garden. Her husband sneaks in to steal them, gets caught, and is forced to give up his child, the girl who becomes Rapunzel. But the story's roots, pun intended, go deeper. In older versions, the rampion is a sacred herb tied to fertility, temptation, and healing. It wasn't just a salad, it was a symbol, which makes sense. In a world where hunger stalked every season, a plant that grew fast, required little care, and fed both body and myth, would be treasured. Rampion faded with the arrival of flashier greens, spinach, lettuce, mustard, crops that yielded more predictably and looked better on a merchant's cart. But for a long, quiet age, rampion held its place as the underdog of the garden, humble, hardy, and quietly revered. Today you hold it in your hands, The same plant that fueled foot soldiers, choir boys, and desperate parents with pregnancy cravings. You rub the root between your fingers, letting the soil fall like flour. And you wonder how many other stories are buried out here, just waiting for someone with a lantern and a little curiosity to find them again. You wrap the bunch in a cloth and tuck it into your satchel, not for trade, not for show, but for remembering. A route to connect you to voices that sang in stone churches, to kitchens lit only by rushlight, to the people who ate simply, but never poorly. You walk back through the dark field stars above Rampion below, and a grin creeping across your face because you've tasted a legend, and it's peppery and a little sweet, and somehow exactly what you needed tonight. You're up early today, before the bells, before the birds, before the light even knows what to do with itself. The air bites at your cheeks as you shuffle through the cold morning breath, fogging with every exhale. You're headed to the back of the herbalist's hut, to the muddy patch where the real fire is grown. Not flame, but flavor. You push open the crooked gate, step past a row of frost-nipped fennel, and there it is, horseradish. Now that's a root that doesn't pretend to be friendly. Big, gnarly, and shaped like something you'd use to ward off evil spirits. And honestly, it kind of does. One sniff of the freshly grated stuff, and your sinuses are blown wide open. Your eyes are watering, and your ancestors are applauding. This root, Armoracea rusticana, is not subtle. It was the medieval version of a slap to the face. And that's precisely why people loved it. You wrench one from the soil, and even uncut it. Smells intense, sharp, medicinal, like pepper and vinegar. Had a loud argument, and forgot to whisper. The root is dense, heavy in your hand, like it knows it's about to cause trouble. Horseradish was rarely the star of the meal. It was the spicy sidekick, the condiment that could make a boiled ox tongue slightly less depressing. Monks ground it into paste and mixed it with sour cream or vinegar, creating a kind of medieval wasabi. In an age when salt was expensive and food preservation leaned heavily on drying and smoking horseradish, brought everything back to life. Historians still argue whether horseradish was more food or medicine. Monastic records list it as a digestive aid, a sinus clearer, and an herb of fire. It was prescribed for fevers, sluggish stomachs, and damp humors of the spleen, which is doctor speak for you're gross, and we don't know why. Here's your quirky detail. One 14th century herbal claims, horseradish banishes melancholy if sniffed before sunrise, which either means it was the world's first antidepressant or just so pungent it shocked people out of sadness. Either way, not a bad trick. You remember your first encounter with the stuff a winter feast, where everything on the table was brown, gray, or beige. The meat was, let's call it, optimistic. Then, someone brought out a wooden bowl of horseradish paste. One bite, and suddenly you were wide awake, sweating slightly, and aware of every pore on your face. A good reminder that vegetables don't always have to be polite. What's fascinating is how horseradish didn't just survive the centuries it thrived. While delicate greens came and went, this root dug in and refused to leave. It grows aggressively, spreads easily, and will take over your garden if you let it. In fact, some gardeners call it the root that won't go quietly. Its fire is chemical. A compound called allyl, isothiocyanate, is released when the root is crushed. The same compound found in mustard and wasabi. That sharp sensation isn't a flavor, it's a chemical reaction in your nasal passages. You're not just tasting horseradish, you're experiencing it like a weather event. Even in the Middle Ages, horseradish had range. Some people pickled it, others boiled it into syrups. In a few eastern territories, it was mixed with apples or dried cherries into a kind of proto-chutney, sweet, sour, sharp, and unforgettable. Peasants used it. Nobles sniffed it before battle. Monks rubbed it on sore joints. You stare at the root in your hand and think this thing could kill a cold cure, boredom, and start a bar fight all before lunch. And yet, today, it's mostly forgotten, relegated to dusty jars in the fridge door, watered down, processed, a shadow of its former self. But maybe it's time for a comeback, not just as a condiment, but as a reminder. Vegetables can be bold. They can bite back. They can stand at the center of the plate and say, "Yeah, I'm spicy, deal with it." You carry the root inside, where the cook greets you with a wary glance. "That again?" she asks, already reaching for the vinegar. You nod. "It's cold out," you say. "This'll warm them up." And you're right. Within minutes, the kitchen fills with the unmistakable scent of horseradish, like biting air, like waking up fast, like forgetting your cough in favor of a sneeze so mighty it echoes into next week. You laugh even as your eyes water, because this is horseradish, medieval fire, the root that doesn't whisper, it roars. Dawn again, though this time it's soft and quiet, less of a slap and more of a sigh. The fog hangs low, and dew collects on every leaf, like the garden's been polished overnight. You move slowly now. Not because you're tired, though. Let's be honest. You are. But because this next plant demands a certain gentleness. You push open the wooden gate to the cloister garden, where the monks grow their more delicate things. And there, nestled beside rows of violets and early peas, is a patch of lacy, light green fronds swaying just so in the breeze. You've found chervil. Chervil is subtle. It's not here to show off. It doesn't burst with color or attack the senses. It's the kind of herb that knows its own worth and refuses to explain itself to people in a hurry. You pluck a few leaves and inhale. It smells like licorice's quiet cousin, sweet herbal fresh, almost too refined for a vegetable patch. In the medieval world, chervil was spring's first whisper. While other herbs bided their time, chervil crept up early, one of the very first green things to poke through the cold. It was the secret ingredient in soups, stews, and especially the seasonal tonic called green pottage, a healing mix of every fresh thing you could find. It may not have the bombast of horseradish or the persistence of skirret, but chervil played a very important role. It reminded people that life was still happening, even in a world dominated by turnips and frost. Historians still argue whether chervil was native to Western Europe or brought over by Roman herbalists who treated it like parsley with a literary degree. The plant is mentioned in ancient texts, but the medieval monks perfected its cultivation, often growing it near the altar garden for both culinary and symbolic uses. It was said to warm the heart and strengthen the spirit. Not bad for a handful of leaves that look like carrot tops with aspirations. Here's your fringe tidbit. Some monks believed that chervil aided in contemplation. A few leaves in your midday broth, and you'd find yourself more attuned to scripture, or at least less inclined to drift off during long psalms. It was even planted along the edges of cloister walkways, so the scent would rise gently as the brothers passed by, brushing robes against the fronds. You recall one Good Friday, many years back, when the chervil was at its peak. The cook made a green sauce so light and fragrant, it felt like drinking sunlight. It was paired with hard-boiled eggs and lentils, and though not a soul spoke during the meal, every face softened just a little with each bite. Chervil doesn't like heat. That's its Achilles heel. Once summer settles in, it bolts, sending up flowers and losing all its delicate flavor. It's a cool weather diva. Give it a mild spring, and it'll perform. Let the temperature climb too fast, and it'll disappear. That, more than anything else, is why it fell out of favor. Modern agriculture likes predictable. It likes tough. It likes does well in transport. Chervil does none of those things. It's fragile wilts quickly and doesn't appreciate being jostled, so it got replaced. Parsley took over its job. Cilantro stole its spotlight. Even fennel muscled in with its brash licorice tones. But chervil still waits. In France, it survived as part of the Fine's herbs, blend along with tarragon chives and parsley. In Germany, it found its way into Grün Soße, that herby green sauce served pas with potatoes and eggs. And in forgotten corners of Britain, it still grows wild if you know where to look and know what to smell for. You run your fingers through the feathery leaves, again, careful not to bruise them. Then gather a few handfuls into your satchel, already imagining the soft soup they'll become. You won't need much. Chervil is quiet, but persuasive. A whisper of it will color the whole dish. And isn't that the point? Not every vegetable has to shout. Some just have to show up early, offer a little beauty, and remind you that spring is coming, and some things are meant to be fleeting. You leave the cloister garden with light step. There's a sweetness in your nose and something softer in your chest, because sometimes the forgotten things aren't forgotten at all. They're just waiting for you to notice them again. By midday, you find yourself at the edge of the world again, or at least that's how it feels. The cliff path is thin and slippery, carved out by stubborn feet over generations. Below you, jagged rocks and a sea that doesn't seem particularly interested in whether you make it home. You're not here for sightseeing. You're here for samphire. Yes, samphire. The vegetable you have to risk your life to find. The plant that grows on wind-swept cliffs and salt-crusted rocks where no respectable vegetable should ever try. It clings to the crevices like green lightning, spiky and electric, and it tastes like a secret whispered by Poseidon. You spot a patch not far from the edge, its stubby finger-like stalks sticking up like someone spilled a bowl of succulent twigs. You crouch, balance on your boots, and snip off a few stems. The scent hits immediately sea spray, citrus, and something unmistakably green. Raw samphire is crunchy, briny, and refreshing, like eating the ocean with a side of celery. Blanched, briefly, it becomes tender, its saltiness mellowing into a perfect pairing for roasted fish stews, or even just butter and bread. Medieval folk knew its worth. Though it wasn't cultivated in neat rows, samphire was sought after by coastal communities who understood that the most dangerous ingredients often brought the boldest flavors. Some even built precarious scaffolds along cliff sides just to reach it. Historians still argue whether samphire was considered food medicine or madness. In some records, it appears in lists of seaside herbs. In others, it's lumped in with trade goods sold in jars, preserved in vinegar, and shipped to inland monasteries that had no business tasting the tide. Here's your quirky tidbit. Shakespeare himself name-dropped samphire in King Lear, calling cliffside harvesting a dreadful trade. Which, yes, because one wrong step and your snack becomes your eulogy. But clearly, it was worth it. You remember a fisherman named Aldred, who once brought in a satchel of samphire so fresh it still dripped sea mist. The kitchen went silent. The cook seared it with garlic and rabbit fat, added a splash of cider, and served it with black bread. The Baron's guests didn't know what hit them. They asked if it was some rare Venetian green. Aldred just laughed, his teeth missing, but his pride intact. Samphire had another name in those days, glasswort, because the ash from its burned stalks was rich in alkali and used in the making of medieval glass. That's right, this salty, crunchy little plant didn't just spice up your stew. It helped build stained glass windows, the kind saints gaze through while you chew your supper. You taste a stalk raw, bright, tangy, almost lemony. Your tongue tingles. Your boots slide. Slightly. You remember again that this is the kind of vegetable that demands respect. It's not a domesticated darling. It's a wild survivor. It won't grow in your polite garden patch. It wants wind and salt and danger. And maybe that's why it was mostly forgotten, because once vegetables got moved to clean grocery aisles and tidy rows, samphire refused to follow. But it's still here, in the tidal zones, in the cracks of coastal cliffs, in the wet dreams of ambitious chefs who want something unusual to plate beside their wild-caught trout. It's made a quiet comeback, like a rock star doing acoustic sets under a fake name. You gather your handful and descend, legs aching from the climb, fingers stinging from the cold. Back in the village, the cook eyes the samphire like it's treasure. And in a way it is. Food that makes you work for it. That makes you listen. Later that night, the fire crackles and the room smells of the sea. The samphire sizzles and goose fat wilts just slightly, then lands on a piece of smoked herring, like it was always meant to be there. You chew, you sigh, you understand. Because samphire doesn't just feed you, it dares you. And if that's not the point of forgotten vegetables, what is? Tonight, the hearth glows with a steady orange pulse, and you've taken to peeling root vegetables with a paring knife that's older than your boots. Outside, frost is creeping across the window panes like a slow brewing spell. But inside, there's warmth and the promise of something both familiar and forgotten. Parsnips. Ah yes, parsnips, the white carrots of the medieval world. The unassuming royalty of winter tables. Sweet, dependable, a little lumpy, but always ready to roast mash or fry its way into your gratitude. Before potatoes were so much as a glimmer on Europe's culinary map, parsnips were the go-to starchy root. You slice into one, and it smells faintly of earth and sugar. You taste a sliver, raw crisp, a little nutty, with that signature sweetness that deepens once it's been kissed by frost. That's the trick with parsnips. They get sweeter in the cold. The chill turns starch into sugar. Nature's candy with dirt on it. In medieval kitchens, parsnips were the workhorse. Rich in calories, easy to grow, and incredibly versatile. Roasted with oil or fat, boiled into pottage, fried into little cakes, mashed into a soft, creamy cloud for the sick and the old. Even brewed into a rudimentary beer or wine when barley was scarce. Historians still argue whether parsnips were ever truly revered or just respected out of necessity. Some accounts treat them as peasant fare, reliable, but uninspired. Others suggest they were cherished enough to be served at feasts, especially when sweetened with honey or paired with game. Here's a quirky tidbit. Parsnips were often used to sweeten desserts before cane sugar became widely available. That's right. If you wanted a sweet pie in 13th century England, odds are there was a parsnip or two mashed into the filling. It wasn't cheating. It was innovation. You remember a traveling minstrel who once bartered 2 songs for a bowl of parsnip pudding. The dish was simple parsnips, cream breadcrumbs, a hint of cinnamon. But the way he closed his eyes after the first bite, you'd think he'd just tasted divinity itself. He played for another hour after that, probably because his belly was warm and he didn't want to move. Parsnips are humble. That's part of their charm. They grow quietly without fanfare. They don't beg for attention in the garden like tomatoes or peas. You toss the chopped parsnips into a pan with onions and wild thyme. Drizzle a bit of oil and let them roast beside the fire. The aroma is sweet, nutty, slightly caramelized. It's the scent of comfort, of history, of dinners eaten from wooden bowls with cold fingers and grateful hearts. And when you taste the first piece still hot from the pan, you smile, because parsnips don't pretend to be anything other than what they are. They're not here to impress you. They're here to feed you. And isn't that enough? It's late now. The stars are dull pinpricks behind a veil of cloud, and the wind has taken on that sharp, whispering edge that sneaks through your cloak and rattles your bones. You're standing near the village edge, just beyond the last crooked fence post, where the earth turns to scrub, and the fields look like they're bracing themselves for something. Out here, things grow differently. Not delicately, not prettily, but stubbornly. And right now, your boot has struck something solid beneath the frost-hardened dirt. You kneel, dig your fingers into the soil, and pull up a globular, gritty, purple-tinged root. The turnip. No applause, no fireworks, just the vegetable that arguably fed more medieval mouths than any other. Humble hardy, and a little misunderstood, the turnip has long been cast as the background actor in history's great culinary drama. But let's get something straight. Before potatoes, before rice, before bread was affordable, there were turnips. And they weren't just food. In some corners of Europe, they were everything. You brush off the dirt and take a bite of a raw slice, peppery crisp, with a slightly bitter tang. Not subtle, but if you roast it, mash it, slice it into a stew with onions and wild herbs, it sings. Not loudly, not with flair, but with that grounded, warming hum that says, "You'll be all right." Historians still argue whether the turnip's role in medieval revolts is overstated or underappreciated. One thing's certain: when harvests failed and lords still demanded taxes, it was root vegetables, like the turnip, that made survival possible. And when even that was taken away, things got loud. In the 14th century, angry peasants in Flanders reportedly used turnip fields as rallying points, meeting in the dark among the rows to grumble plot and swear by the roots they'd rather eat than surrender. Some accounts even mention turnips being hurled at tax collectors. A message, not just a vegetable. Here's your quirky detail. One obscure French record describes a village wedding where turnips were carved into lanterns filled with sheep tallow and hung from trees to keep the ghosts away and the wine flowing. A root, a symbol, a party decoration, truly a multitasker. You remember the famine of 48? No, not that one, the other one, the one where the barley rotted in the sacks and the river carried off half the cabbages. That year, the turnip fields held, barely, but enough. You roasted them with old garlic, chewed them raw when the fire went out, even ground the greens into soup when things got thin. You don't remember the hunger fondly, but you do remember the turnips. The leaves, too, had value. Rich in iron, bitter, but nourishing. They were boiled down into pottages, mixed with oats, or fed to livestock, when people had just enough not to hoard. Nothing was wasted. Even the skins went into compost to feed the next year's crop. And yet, for all their reliability, turnips were never glamorous. Nobles scoffed. Cooks rolled their eyes. Even peasants, when times improved, often moved on to better roots. Parsnips, carrots, beets. The turnip became a punchline, a symbol of poverty, a food you'd only eat if you had no choice. But you know better, because while wheat failed, and apples rotted, and pigs caught fever, the turnip just kept going. Through frost, through flood, through feudal nonsense. You carry the bulb in your hand now, heavy and cool. There's strength in it. Memory. The weight of thousands of meals and quiet dinners where people didn't talk much, but still somehow made it through. Back in the kitchen, you dice it and drop it into a pot with lentils, garlic, and the last chunk of salt pork. The broth bubbles slowly. The smell is sharp, then savory, then just right. You serve it in wooden bowls, no frills, just heat and flavor, and the kind of silence that comes from people eating something they didn't expect to enjoy this much. Someone asks what's in it. You just say turnip. They raise an eyebrow, then go in for a second bite. Because that's the thing about turnips. They never ask to be loved. They just hope to be remembered. The wind tonight howls through the trees like a choir of wolves, and you're walking the edge of the forest. Lantern swinging from your hand boots, crunching over roots and leaf litter. You're not looking for something elegant. You're looking for something rough, something ancient. And as you kneel beside a gnarled oak and dig through the frost-hardened soil, your fingers brush something bristly and obstinate. You've found burdock. Now this is a plant that dares you to eat it. Spiky, clingy, armored in burrs, it doesn't exactly scream edible. But beneath that medieval body, armor, lies a root rich in flavor, folklore, and stubborn charm. You pull one free, and it fights you the whole way long, and tapering, covered in dirt, and the kind of tiny roots that tangle like a bad idea. Its skin is dark, almost bark-like, and smells earthy, like the forest's breath after rain. In medieval times, Arctium lapa wasn't exactly the belle of the banquet, but it was there, quietly feeding herbalists, healers, and anyone too poor or too wise to ignore its value. The root was roasted, boiled, sliced into broth, or dried into tea. The leaves were poulticed. Even the seeds were pressed into oil or ground for medicine. Historians still argue whether burdock was more popular in the British Isles or in the lowlands of Europe, where folk healers swore by its cleansing properties. Monastic scribes noted it for treating skin ailments, inflammation, and even plague boils, though that might have been hopeful thinking. Here's your quirky tidbit. Burdock inspired one of the most famous modern inventions. In 1941, a Swiss engineer studied its sticky burrs covered in tiny hooks and mimicked the mechanism to create, yes, Velcro. So every time your sneakers close with that satisfying RR yeep, you can thank a forgotten medieval vegetable for clinging to a dog's fur. But back then, burdock wasn't about convenience. It was about survival. When turnips were gone, and even parsnips had shriveled to twigs, burdock still held firm in the cold earth. It required effort, digging deep, cleaning thoroughly, cooking carefully, but that's what made it valuable. It asked something of you, and gave something back. You remember a winter gathering at the healer's hut, where she served roasted burdock with onions, garlic, and wild greens. It tasted like smoke and soil, and something much older than you. It wasn't fancy. It was grounding, nourishing in a way that made your shoulders unclench and your eyes close for a second longer than usual. Its bitterness could be tempered with vinegar, its toughness softened with slow heat. And in a stew, it offered not just bulk, but character, an earthy base that didn't need to shout. It just needed time. But burdock was never fashionable. Too hairy, too aggressive, too messy for market shelves. As agriculture industrialized, it was left behind. Its stubbornness became a liability, and the burrs a nuisance. Livestock hated them, cloth snagged. Children came home covered in spiky souvenirs. So it was cut from the guest list. But it's still here, growing in forgotten corners, along fences, beside streams, in places no one bothers to weed anymore. And some chefs, those curious, restless ones, have begun to rediscover it. They pickle it, grill it, slice it thin into salads. And when people taste it, they're surprised. "You can eat this?" they ask. Oh, yes, and you should. Because burdock isn't just edible, it's enduring. It reminds you that nourishment doesn't always come pretty, that survival sometimes comes wrapped in burrs, and that food worth eating often takes work. You clean the root by firelight, scrubbing off decades of neglect. Then you chop it into coins and toss it into a pan with broth, dried mushrooms, and wild thyme. It smells of comfort, of grit, of resilience, and as you eat, you feel connected, not just to those who ate it before, but to the land itself, to the struggle, the scraping, the slow, quiet strength it takes to thrive in difficult places. That's burdock, the armored root, the underdog, the hook-laden survivor who sticks with you, literally and otherwise. And it never asks for thanks, only that you remember. There's something about walking into the woods at night that makes you feel older than you are. The trees arch above like ancient ribs, and the ground beneath your boots crackles with the sigh of fallen leaves. You move carefully now, stepping over twisted roots and under low-hanging branches drawn by the faint scent of something green, something wild, something that once fed the soul as much as the body. You're looking for wild leeks. Yes, wild leeks, also called japs, or Allium tricoccum, the original allium. Before modern onions strutted in before garlic grew fat and easy in fields, there were leeks. But these aren't the ones you buy in a bundle at the market. These are the ones that grow beneath the forest canopy, their broad leaves catching dappled sunlight, their aroma unmistakable, pungent, earthy, and somehow holy. You kneel and find a patch near the base of a mossy elm, their green shoots fanning out in little clusters. You dig gently, reverently, and lift one from the ground. The bulb is slender, pearly white, with a pink blush near the base. You crush a leaf between your fingers. The scent rises like memory. In medieval Europe, wild leeks weren't just a food, they were a ritual. Gathered in spring, right as the snow melted, and the world began to hum with life again. They were the first green things after a long winter. And when you tasted them, your blood seemed to warm from the inside out. Monks grew them in walled gardens. Forest folk foraged them by moonlight. Herbalists praised their cleansing qualities. And yes, some folks even whispered that leeks protected against evil spirits. Historians still argue whether this belief stemmed from Celtic Druidic rites, early Christian symbolism, or the simple fact that wild leeks made people feel alive again after months of salted meat and dried legumes. Here's your fringe tidbit. The leek was such a beloved symbol of vitality that Welsh soldiers wore them into battle. And not just pinned to their tunics, they sometimes ate them mid-march raw to heat the blood and steady the breath. You try chewing one raw yourself. It hits like garlic, and onion had a baby that punches. You remember a feast during Lent, meatless spare, but beautiful in its own way. The cook served a soup of wild leeks, nettles, and cracked barley, finished with a swirl of goat's milk. It tasted like forgiveness. Like the forest giving you a second chance. Like spring knocking at the door. The wild leek doesn't tolerate arrogance. It won't grow in rows. It resents domestication. Try planting it in a tidy bed, and it will sulk. But let it alone in the forest. Let it feel the shift of the seasons and the rhythm of rainfall, and it will flourish. Slowly. Secretly. That's why it's still rare. It's not a crop. It's a gift. One that requires patience, restraint, and a little reverence. And yet, modern chefs and foragers have found it again. In spring, they trek out to Appalachian forests or forgotten glades in Europe to gather ramps in small bundles. There are warnings: now don't overharvest. Leave the bulbs, take a few leaves. The plant is strong, but not invincible. You cook them, simply sautéed with eggs, maybe folded into a tart, maybe stirred into soup. The flavor is sharp, but sweetens as it cooks. A transformation, like winter to spring, like silence to song. And as you eat, you don't just feel full, you feel seen by the forest, by the ghosts of every herbalist and forager who walked these woods before you, by something older than memory. Because wild leeks aren't just about taste, they're about timing. They show up when you need them, quietly, just for a while, and then they vanish until next year, until you're ready again. You pack the last of the leaves into your satchel and head back through the trees. The lantern sways, casting long shadows that ripple across the undergrowth. Behind you, the forest breathes. Ahead, the cottage glows. You cross the threshold, kick off your boots, and set the wild leeks on the table. There's a crackling fire, a bowl of warm broth, and the sense deep in your bones that you've just reconnected with something sacred. Not fancy, not rare, just real and wild and waiting, just like you. And now we settle. You've journeyed through forgotten gardens and wind-swept coastlines, dug through cold soil, listened to firewood crackle, smelled vinegar, earth, wild herbs, and roasted roots. You've gathered plants that don't often make headlines, but fed generations, filled bowls, healed bodies, and offered comfort in the dark months. And in doing so, maybe you felt something shift, a softening, a remembering. Because these vegetables weren't just food, they were resilience, adaptability, survival. They were how people got through hard winters and lean springs. They were the color in a gray world, the thing on your plate that said you made it, and you did. So as you lie back now, feel the weight lift from your shoulders. Let the warmth from the imaginary hearth wrap around you like a blanket. Breathe deep through your nose if the horseradish didn't completely destroy it, and let your mind wander back to that monastery garden, that briny cliffside, that forest glade where wild leeks waited beneath the frost. You've tasted history. You've survived with flavor. And best of all, you've remembered something that the modern world almost forgot. Sleep well, fellow forager. May your dreams be filled with sweet roots and salty greens, and may you wake tomorrow with a bit of dirt under your nails and the lingering taste of something ancient on your tongue.